Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is waive. This particular verb was suggested by the viewer Luis, and I just want to say a quick thank you for the suggestion. Now, let's take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first thing I want to point out is you're going to notice all of our definitions here are going to connect to the law, legal rights or legal obligations. This is a pretty difficult verb that will be used in those types of situations. So let's look a little more closely now at the definition. Now, with this verb waive, you're going to see the word refrain used, and this might be a new one. So I want us to think about kind of stop as the meaning here. So the first way the verb waive gets used is to refrain from insisting on or using a right or a claim. Now, for this first definition, it might help to think about maybe some TV shows or movies that you have seen. And if you can kind of picture someone being arrested in a particular movie, there is a certain sentence that police will state to someone who's being arrested, making them aware of their rights, right? Saying, you don't have to talk to us, you don't have to answer questions, right? But sometimes somebody goes, no, 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 I want to talk, right? So they are not using that right. So we might say they waived their right. A second way to use the verb waive is to mean to refrain from applying or enforcing a particular rule, a restriction, or a fee. Sometimes you might hear about an organization waiving application fees, right? Again, it means they're stopping application fees. It might be for a particular period of time or for a very specific type of service that is being offered. A third way the verb waive gets used is to mean to refrain from engaging in some other activity or action. Could also mean to cancel or postpone something. Occasionally, you might hear about someone waiving a meeting, right? And it might mean the meeting has been canceled or it has been postponed. You should know the verb waive is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, we have a verb that ends with a vowel, a consonant, and E, so we're going to drop the E before we add ing. That makes waving. The past tense and participle forms of this verb require that we just add the letter D since this verb already ends in an E. Our base verb, wave, ends in a voiced consonant sound, of a V sound. Because it's voiced, this means that our ed ending is just going to make a D sound, and we're not going to add an extra syllable as we say it. So it should sound like this: waved, waved. Okay. Now, you might be happy to know no additional phrasal verbs for us to discuss today. So we're going to move on and practice making verbs in two different verb tenses. Today we're going to practice the past perfect and the simple future. Let's start with the past perfect. We use this verb tense to talk about a completed action. And sometimes I have students say, well, Katie, we have the simple past tense for that. I don't need the past perfect. But what the past perfect does is tell the person who's reading my writing or maybe who's listening to me speaking that I'm focusing that an action occurred before something else, maybe another action or before a certain point in time. The nice thing about making past perfect sentences is that our structure is going to stay the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative or positive, we're going to have our subject. We're going to use the past form of have, which is had, and then we use the participle form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. Just before the game, the team announced that they had waived the player earlier in the day. Okay? We actually see this verb waive used a lot in professional sports. And you might be thinking, well, that seems odd. But remember, I told you earlier there's this legal connection to it. So it has to do with a contract and sort of being able to for a team, I should say, for a team to be able to say, this player is sort of ours. Other teams cannot have this player's services. But they stop on that right in certain situations. So here, this particular team in our example sentence is saying this person is kind of up for grabs. He or she can join another team. Now let's talk about making negative past perfect sentences. To do this, I start with my subject, I use had, not, and then the participle form the verb. You might also see had not combined into the contraction hadn't. An example of this. The accused hadn't waived her right to a speedy trial at earlier hearings. So again, this goes back to this idea in the United States. If you are accused of a particular crime, you have a right to a speedy trial. It means we can't wait 5 years, 10 years for a judge or a jury to decide whether you are innocent, or I should say guilty or not guilty. Okay, so here, right, we're saying this person did not give up that right. They did not stop on insisting for this. Finally, let's talk about making a yes or no question in the past perfect. To do this, you start with had, then you're going to have your subject, and then the participle form the verb. Here's our last past perfect example. Had the landlord waived rental application fees before? Okay? We're kind of wanting to know, again, did this action occur before a certain point in the past? Now let's move on and talk about making sentences in the simple future. Today, we're going to focus on making sentences with will. Will can be used to talk about people's plans. It's a little more common to hear it used with predictions, promises, and offers. The nice thing about making sentences in the simple future with will is that our structure is going to stay the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, I'm going to have my subject, I'm going to have will, and then I'm going to have the base verb. Here's an example sentence. The IRS will waive penalties for individuals owing back taxes for 2020 or 2021. Okay. This was a fairly recent announcement, right? Announcing kind of those future plans, or some might say a promise from the IRS. Listen, if you pay the taxes you owe, we're not going to add on extra penalties, right? We're waiving or we're stopping the penalties. Let's take a look at making negative sentences in the simple future. To do this, I start with my subject, I use will not, and then the base verb. You might also see the contraction for will not, won't. That's used in my example here. The star athlete won't waive his no trade clause. Okay? So sometimes a professional athlete will have it part of his or her contract that they cannot be traded to another team unless they give approval, unless they say it's okay. So here, and this does happen where some athletes will say, well, which team are you trading me to? Oh, okay, that's okay. And so they waive, they give up that right. Here, someone is saying, I'm not going to do that in the future here. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple future. To do this, I start with will, then I have my subject, and then the base verb. Last example. Will the animal shelter waive adoption fees this weekend? Sometimes they do this in order to encourage more people to adopt pets and sort of reduce how many pets the shelter is caring for at a particular time. Now let's move on and talk about a related word. The first word we're going to talk about today is the noun waiver. Okay? This noun can have a couple different meanings. The first is to refer to the act or instance of giving up or waiving a particular right or a claim. An example of this: the road test waiver program for teenagers ended on December 31st. This is something that happened during the pandemic. So, in most US states, a teenager has to take what's called like an on the road test. So, they get in a test or they get in a car and show that they are capable of driving. But because of the pandemic and concerns about spreading the virus in some states, um, there was kind of an instance of stopping this right to a test. Instead, many parents kind of observed their kids and vouched, said, yes, I've watched my son or daughter practice and they're ready. So many of those programs are now ending. A second way to use the noun waiver is to really refer to a document that explains and maybe illustrates what rights or claims are being given up or are being waived. An example of this: all runners need to sign a waiver before competing in the race. This is pretty common with a number of events, things you want to participate in. You might have a lot of fine print. Many times it comes down to, if you get injured, you're not going to sue us, right? We're not responsible if you get injured in something that sounds maybe like a community 5K or something of that nature. Now, the next part of this video, I want to talk about a word that could be easily confused with our verb of the day, waive, W-A-I-V-E, and that is a word that is both a verb and a noun, W-A-V-E. So waive, W-A-V-E, can be both a verb and a noun. One way the verb gets used is to talk about kind of moving our hand or an object, what's said to and fro. So kind of think back and forth, that idea. So an example of this verb in a sentence might be, I always wave to my neighbors as I walk or drive by them. Now, the noun waive can have several different meanings. The first, I've got a picture to help us understand, that is a long body of water that kind of curls into an arch form. And I hope you can see that in the picture. You might see waves in the ocean. If you're near an ocean, you might hear somebody say something like, oh man, the waves are really high today. The noun wave can also be referred to that particular gesture. So a gesture or maybe even a signal, again, generally by moving our hands. An example of this: please give me a wave when you are ready to continue. Sometimes I say things like that in my online classes, so I know when we're ready to move to the next activity or we're maybe ready to begin sharing answers, right? It can be helpful for students to go kind of get my attention and know I'm ready to continue. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.